What's up, guys? Justin here with my starts and sits for Fantasy Football Week 13. I want to quickly apologize that this is coming out after Thanksgiving, meaning there were 3 less games that I was able to help out with. But let's jump right into the quarterbacks that I'd be looking to start this week. Jacoby Brissett is getting yet another start from me. He's finished as a top 12 quarterback in all 6 of his starts so far this season, and this week he gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who allow the 3rd most points to the position. I am a bit worried that if Baker can't go, this game may not be as high scoring, causing the Cardinals to not need to pass. But I still think Brissett is a solid option, as Tampa Bay does have a good run defense. Drake May has been on my starts list for over half of the season already, and he is on here once again as he takes on the New York Giants. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing QBs. And Drake May has had a top 12 finish in 9 of his 12 starts so far this season, and I expect him to finish as a QB1 once again this week. Bo Nix hasn't finished in the top 12 since week 8, but I think he gets back in there this week after his matchup against the Commanders. Washington is bottom 5 in pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed. They also allow the 7th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. This is a perfect get-right game for Bo Nix. Kirk Cousins is a deeper option that I wouldn't mind streaming this week either. He gets the Jets, who allow 17 fantasy points to quarterbacks, which is smack dab in the middle relative to the rest of the league, but the Jets are a bottom 5 team in pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed. Cam Ward is a deeper option too. He's coming off his best fantasy performance of the season, finishing as the QB4 in Week 12. He threw for 250 yards and a touchdown, but he also added 37 yards on the ground and a rushing touchdown. He gets the Jags this week, who allow the 5th most fantasy points to the position. You could definitely do worse than Cam Ward this week. Jumping over to the quarterbacks that I'm sitting this week, I'm starting off by sitting Daniel Jones. He takes on an extremely difficult matchup against the Texans. Houston gives up the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks and is a top 2 passing defense in terms of EPA allowed and DVOA. Jones also hasn't been a top 12 quarterback since week 8. With QB2 performances against other solid defenses. Marcus Mariota is coming off the QB9 performance in his last game against the Dolphins before his bye, but I am sitting him this week against the Broncos, who allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. The Broncos are also top 5 in pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed. Geno Smith and the Raiders offense honestly just suck, and they draw a tough matchup this week against the Los Angeles Chargers. Chargers give up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to the position and are a top 10 passing defense in terms of the advanced stats. Brock Purdy has thrown 7 interceptions across his 4 starts this season, and he has only 1 top 12 finish. This week, he gets the Browns defense, who are 4th best against quarterbacks. They have the best pass rush in the NFL, while also being in the top 10 in terms of pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed. Aaron Rodgers looks to be back after missing week 12, but I am sitting him against the team who gives up the 6th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position, the Buffalo Bills. They are also top half in the league in terms of the advanced stats. Let's jump over to the running back position and start with my starts. Trevion Henderson played 65% of snaps last week, which featured the return of Ramondre Stevenson too. He finally appears to be the RB1 in New England, and this week they get the Giants, who are at the bottom of the league in terms of rush defense DVOA and PFF run defense grade. They also allow the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs, so go ahead and confidently start Trevion for the 2nd straight week. Kenneth Gainwell has been encroaching on Jalen Warren's usage the past few weeks, partially due to Warren's ankle injury. Though I do think both are startable options this week against the Bills, who allow the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Buffalo is also bottom 5 in run defense DVOA and EPA allowed on rushing plays. Breece Hall is getting a start from me in a matchup with the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons have a solid pass defense, but they could definitely be ran on. Plus, they are 4th worst in the league against running backs in fantasy football. They're bottom 5 in the advanced rushing stats too. Travis Etienne was back into the Jaguars starting running back spot last week, and he put up over 100 total yards and a touchdown. This week he draws the Titans, who give up the 5th most fantasy points to the position. RJ Harvey's usage isn't quite where we want it to be following the J.K. Dobbins injury, but maybe something will change over their bye. Regardless, I still want to be starting Harvey this week in a matchup against the 9th worst team against running backs. The Commanders are also bottom 10 in PFF run defense grade, though Harvey has been utilized more in the passing game. Though, the Commanders' defense is so bad, so go ahead and start the rookie. The running backs that I'm sitting include Rico Dowdle. Now, Dowdle is likely the waiver wire pickup of the year, but I am benching him in his Week 13 matchup against the Rams. The Rams are top 5 in terms of run defense DVOA, PFF run defense grade and EPA allowed. They also give up the third fewest fantasy points to the position. Rico, thank you for your service, but you should probably see the bench this week. In fantasy, of course. Aaron Jones draws a less than ideal matchup with the Seahawks this week. They are the 10th best against the running back position in terms of fantasy football and are top 3 in rush defense DVOA and EPA allowed. Also, the Vikings offense is atrocious right now, so I really do not want to start him. I doubt you want to start Jacoby Krosky-Merritt at this point in the season, or even Chris Rodriguez, but if you are thinking about it, I have to deter you. The Broncos sit in the top 5 in the advanced rushing stats, and they give up the 5th fewest fantasy points to running backs. Please stop trusting Bill and go ahead and move on. In a similar conversation, you probably don't want to be starting Tony Pollard. Plus, he takes on the Jaguars, who don't have a great passing defense, but their run defense is pretty solid. They rank in the top 10 in rush defense DVOA, and they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points to the position. I outright dropped Tony Pollard last week, and you should probably do so too. Let's jump over the wide receivers that I'm looking to start this week. Khalil Shakir is the only somewhat consistent Bills wide receiver, and he is getting a start for me as they take on the Steelers, who give up the most fantasy points to opposing wideouts. Analytically, the Steelers' defense isn't all that bad, but Shakir is Josh Allen's go-to guy and gets a great matchup in terms of fantasy points allowed. Troy Franklin and Courtland Sutton are both solid starts this week too as they take on the Commanders. Commanders give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers and have the worst PFF coverage grade in the entire NFL. I think these guys can both produce this week, so get them in your lineups. One of these guys is bound to bust, but I think you can throw each one of the Jaguars wide receivers into your lineups this week. Brian Thomas, Parker Washington, and Jacoby Myers are all getting a start from me in a matchup against the Tennessee Titans, who allow the 4th most fantasy points to the position. They are also bottom 10 in pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed. A very similar thing can be said about the Chargers wide receivers. Ladd, obviously, Keenan, and QJ are all startable too in a matchup with the Raiders. Las Vegas has a bottom 3 PFF coverage grade, and they allow the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers, so go ahead and start them. Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch are startable too as long as Marvin Harrison remains sidelined. Both have been significant producers these last 2 weeks, and they get the Buccaneers, who are the 8th worst against wide receivers in all of fantasy football. Continue to roll with the hot hands in these two. Now let's jump over to the wide receivers that I'm sitting this week. One of the Colts wide receivers is bound to produce, but I would be looking for better options if I have any of Michael Pittman, Alec Pierce, and Josh Downs. Just like against the quarterback position, the Texans are the best in the NFL against wide receivers. It might be tempting to start Trey Tucker with Jacoby Myers out of town, but I would advise against it. In a tough matchup last week, Tucker only caught 3 passes for 28 yards, even though he saw 10 targets. This week, he gets the Chargers, who allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to wideouts. They are also top 10 in terms of pass defense DVOA and PFF coverage grade. Ricky Pearsall has been extremely disappointing so far this season. He's missed much of it due to injury, and he only caught 3 passes since returning. This week, the 49ers get the Browns, who give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. Unfortunately, I had to start Ricky this past week, and it hurt, but he will definitely be on my bench in week 13. Go ahead and sit just about any Vikings player this week, and that includes Justin Jefferson. It is remarkable that the Minnesota pass offense is so bad that it makes Justin Jefferson look average. And it might be undrafted rookie Max Brosmer this week too. Plus, they get the Seahawks, who are the 10th best against wide receivers, and they are top 10 in pass defense DVOA and PFF coverage grade. And in the final position of the video, let's talk about the tight ends that I'm starting. Juwan Johnson is a great start this week as the Saints take on the Dolphins. Miami is bottom 5 in pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed. They also give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. This is turning out to be a smash start for Johnson. I am not totally up to speed on Dalton Kincaid's injury, but if he's healthy, go ahead and insert him into your lineups too. The Steelers give up the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends, and Kincaid is one of the 2 somewhat consistent pass catchers on the Bills. Dalton Schultz is coming off a 1-catch game, but prior to that, he saw 6 targets in 7 of his last 8, and this week he gets the Colts, who give up the 6th most fantasy points to the position. If Baker Mayfield is healthy, then I'm starting Cade Otton this week against the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals are 7th worst in the league against tight ends, allowing over 15 points per game to the position. And finally, let's look at the tight ends that I'm going to sit this week. Mason Taylor saw 5 targets last week with Tyrod Taylor and a quarterback, but I would not be starting him this week against the Falcons. Atlanta is the 2nd best in the league against the tight end position, so go ahead and look for a better option. Colston Loveland and Cole Kmet both see targets, which isn't great from a fantasy perspective, and they get the Eagles this week, who give up the third fewest points to the position. The Eagles are also top 10 in pass defense DVOA, PFF coverage grade, and EPA allowed, so you might be able to find a better option than the Bears tight ends this week. And lastly, I don't know if you would ever sit Tyler Warren, and I don't know if I would either, but I want to point out that this matchup is very difficult. The Texans are good against pretty much any position, and for tight ends, they are the 6th best in the league. This could be a very difficult game for the Colts offense. Thank you guys for watching this video. Drop any questions that you have in the comments below.